Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. School is supposed to be a place where children play and feel safe and have fun. A place where sometimes things become routine and young minds learn and grow. However, this world is full of unexpected events and tragedies that spit in the face of routine and safety. Today, my fiends, we will hear the tale of the New London explosion, which turned an ordinary school into a war zone. So, let us sit in the front of the class and join the study group so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. The New London explosion is considered the worst school disaster in the United States history. This event is also the worst school accident to take place in Texas history. In the mid-1930s, the Great Depression was in full swing. However, the London School District was one of the richest in America. In 1930, oil rush in Rusk County, Texas, had boosted the local economy, and educational spending grew with it. Its taxable value in 1937 had grown to $20 million, with additional revenue seen from the 15 oil wells on district property. The London School, a large structure of steel and concrete, was constructed in 1932 and cost $1 million, which is roughly $19 million today. The school was built on sloping ground, and the large airspace was enclosed beneath the structure. The school board had overridden an original architect's plans for a boiler and steam distribution system, instead opting to install 72 gas heaters throughout the building. Early in 1937, the school board canceled their natural gas contract and had plumbers install a tap into Parade Gasoline Company's residue gas line to save money. This practice, while not explicitly authorized by local oil companies, was widespread in the area. The natural gas extracted with the oil was considered a waste product and was flared off. At the time, as there was no value to the natural gas, the oil companies turned a blind eye. Untreated natural gas is both odorless and colorless, so leaks are difficult to detect and may go unnoticed. Gas had been leaking from the residue line tap and built up inside the enclosed crawl space that ran the entire 253-foot or 77-meter length of the main building's facade. Students had been complaining of headaches for some time, but little attention had been paid to the issue. How could they have known that the line was leaking? The gas didn't smell like anything. It happened on Thursday, March 18th, 1937. It seemed like any ordinary day. At around 3:17 p.m., that would change. Following the school's normal schedule, 1st through 4th grade students had been let out early. A PTA meeting was being held in the gymnasium, a separate structure, roughly 100 feet or 30 meters from the main building. Approximately 500 students and 40 teachers were in the main building at the time, although some numbers claimed that there were roughly 694 students in the main building and at the campus. At 3:17 p.m., Lemmy R. Butler, an instructor of manual training, turned on an electric sander. It is believed that the sander's switch caused a spark that ignited the gas-air mixture. Just one spark was all that was needed. Reports from witnesses state that the walls of the school bulged. The roof lifted from the building and then crashed back down. The main wing of the structure collapsed. However, there was no fire after the explosion. Survivors in the building claimed that the lockers embedded in the wall were thrown at them by the blast. Others were picked up by the force of the explosion, and plaster and mortar formed a white haze. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton concrete block was thrown clear off the building and crushed a 1936 Chevrolet parked 200 feet away. Those who evacuated the building after the explosion were in a state of shock, with some recounting that they didn't know what to do next. It seemed like the world was deadly silent until the sound came back all at once. The explosion was reportedly heard up to 4 miles away from the school. The most immediate response was from the parents at the PTA meeting. Within minutes, area residents started to arrive and began digging through the rubble, many with their bare hands. Many survivors joined the immediate aftermath and recovery of other survivors and victims. Roughnecks from the oil fields were released from their jobs and brought with them cutting torches and heavy equipment needed to clear the concrete and steel. Not all the buildings on the 10-acre campus were destroyed. School bus driver Lonnie Barber was transporting elementary students to their homes and was in sight of the school as it exploded. Barber continued his 2-hour route returning children to their parents before rushing back to the school to look for his 4 children. His son Arden died, but others were not seriously injured. Other school buses were employed to drive ambulatory survivors back to their homes, causing family members who were waiting at the bus stops to demand information from students disembarking. Here's a clip of the event on the news at the time. I love this music.
It is with deep regret that we bring you these graphic, appalling scenes of one of the greatest tragedies in American history. Hundreds of school children and their teachers killed and mangled, some of them literally blown to bits, others crushed by falling masonry, when their new consolidated grade and high school in the center of the rich East Texas oil field was shattered by a terrific gas explosion. Had the blast occurred 10 minutes later, school would have been dismissed, and the death toll small, perhaps. But it struck when only the lower grades and a few others had left, catching almost the entire student body in an inferno of flying debris and falling walls. There was no warning. Before the eyes of persons in the vicinity, including scores of parents assembled for a meeting in a nearby building, the schoolhouse, one of the finest rural structures in the country, suddenly burst asunder and collapsed. In the remaining hours of daylight and through the long, terrible night, the scenes of the disaster were indescribable, harrowing. A wild confusion of feverish rescue work by floodlights, with their gruesome, ghostly shadows, and everywhere sobbing, hysterical parents, hoping against hope and bravely trying to identify mangled little bodies.
Mangled little bodies.
Hour by hour, the death toll rises. The injured, too, as rescue workers from the nearby oil fields uncover the pitiful remains of their children, or break occasionally into some living tomb. There's scarcely a home in the entire school district untouched by the disaster. A disaster caused, it is believed, by gas pockets, which had collected in the school's sub-basement. In the long list of American catastrophes, this is one of the worst. The entire nation bows in grief.
How tragic an image that conjures up in our minds of students lying dead, while others who were saved were just standing in complete shock. New London was a small town in Texas, so aid poured in from outside the area. Governor of Texas, James V. Allred, dispatched Texas Rangers, Highway Patrol, and the Texas National Guard. 30 doctors, 100 nurses, and 25 embalmers arrived from Dallas. In their desperation to get victims and survivors out of the rubble, many rescuers didn't immediately check if the bodies they came across were dead or alive. Rescuers worked through the night and rain, and 17 hours later, the entire site had been cleared. Many who worked in the rescue were overcome with shock, as one survivor recounted, "Daddy worked so long, he almost had a nervous breakdown. As long as he was working, he was fine, but as soon as he came home and sat down, he'd start shaking." Buildings in the neighboring communities of Henderson, Overton, Kilgore, and as far away as Tyler and Longview were converted into makeshift first aid tents and morgues to house the enormous number of bodies, and everything from family cars to delivery trucks served as hearses and ambulances. A new hospital, Mother Frances Hospital in Tyler, was scheduled to open the next day, but the dedication was canceled and the hospital opened immediately. Reporters who arrived in the city found themselves swept up in the rescue efforts. Walter Cronkite, who went on to become a world-renowned journalist and reporter, also found himself in New London on one of his first assignments for UPI. Although Cronkite went to cover other such events like World War II and the Nuremberg trials, he was quoted as saying decades later, "I did nothing in my studies, nor in my life, to prepare me for a story of the magnitude of that of New London tragedy. Nor has any story since that awful day equaled it." Estimates of the number of dead vary from 296 to 319, but that number could be much higher, as many of the residents of New London at the time were transient oil field workers, and there was no way to determine how many volunteers collected the bodies of their children in the days following the disaster, and returned them to their respected homes for burial. Of the deceased, the majority were from grades 5 through 11, as the younger students were educated in a separate building, and most had already been dismissed from school. The majority of the victims of the explosion are buried in Pleasant Hill Cemetery, with an entire section being designated for the victims. Most of the bodies were either burned beyond recognition or blown to pieces. So it was either crispy critters or just pieces of children were found. Most were identified by clothing or personal items, such as a boy who was identified by the presence of a pull string from his favorite shirt in his jean pockets. A student survivor recounted being in a makeshift morgue. I saw fathers fight over dead children like dogs over a bone, yelling, "That's mine! No, mine!" I saw children who looked like roadkill. You couldn't even tell if it was a boy, girl, or what. That's pretty intense. The bodies were so disfigured that I can just imagine them as either looking like a burnt up mass, or the ones that were crushed to death might have looked like hamburger meat rather than an actual person. Fingerprinting experts were brought in to take fingerprints from the bodies that were disfigured by the explosion. This method of identification was available, as many of the children in the surrounding area had been fingerprinted at the Texas Centennial Exposition the previous summer. At least they could identify some of the bodies if they still had their fingers. The surviving gymnasium was quickly converted into multiple classrooms. Inside tents in modified buildings, classes resumed 10 days later, which I think is a testament to how people used to be less sensitive. I mean, it's not like the students didn't just, witness all their friends die or anything. Have to get back to classes, just business as usual. 30 surviving seniors completed their school year in the gymnasium. A new school was completed on the property in 1939, directly behind the location of the destroyed building. A lawsuit was brought against the school district and the Parade Gasoline Company, but the court ruled that neither could have been held responsible. The president at the time, FDR, also paid his respects, but strangely, so did Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler. Hitler paid his respects in the form of a telegram, a copy of which is on display at the New London Museum. Experts from the United States Bureau of Mines concluded that the connection to the residue gas line was faulty. The connection had allowed gas to leak into the school, and since natural gas is invisible and odorless, the leak went unnoticed. The sanding machine's switch is believed to have caused a spark that ignited the air-gas mixture. To stop any further accidents from happening, the Texas legislature began mandating within weeks of the exposition that thiols, or mercaptans, be added to natural gas. The strong odor of many thiols makes leaks quickly detectable. The practice quickly spread worldwide. Adding these strong-smelling chemicals was really something that revolutionized safety in the oil industry, because nobody at the time knew that the school was a death trap, as the gas was odorless. This accident may have been preventable if this practice had been adopted sooner, but it was little too late for those in New London. Over the years, the New London school explosion received surprisingly little attention, given the magnitude of the event. Explanations for this are speculative, but most center around the residents' unwillingness to discuss the tragedy. L.V. Barber said of his father, Lonnie, "I can remember the newspaper people coming around every now and then, asking him questions about that day, but he never had much to say." A former student mentioned in 2007, "People were afraid to talk about it. Almost no family in the community went unaffected. And whenever people would tell us about the explosion, it would be sort of in whispers. And don't say anything in front of so-and-so because they lost a sister." That's how deeply people were traumatized by this event. They just don't speak about it. While investigations exonerated all parties of blame, stating that no one could have known the odorless gas had been accumulating, some parents were furious to learn that the school had canceled its natural gas contract to tap into the free residue line. The legislature's swift passage of a bill requiring the odorization of natural gas provide little comfort to the grieving families in the town of 1,000 people. Here are some first-hand accounts of the carnage from the survivors. Bill Thompson was in the 5th grade. He states, "I remember the morning of Thursday, the 18th, being a fairly cool spring morning. It was nice, sunshiny. The PTA, which usually met in the auditorium in the janitor senior high school building, moved out to the gymnasium, which was separate from the school. Normally we would have gotten out early because of that meeting, But just before the last period bell rang, it was announced that we would go ahead with our regular dismissal time, 3:30. In that last class of the day, I asked a student to change seats with me so I could flirt with a little girl in front of her. Reba Mosley was in the 9th grade. She remembers that some of my friends and I were complaining that our eyes were stinging that morning. I thought it was just me because my glasses sometimes bother me. Robert Hatfield was in the 5th grade. He recalls, I didn't want to go to school that day, but I asked my mother if I could stay home and she said no. So I started on, got ready, walked out of the door, then turned around and went back inside. I said, can I come home at study period? And she said no. So I went off to school and was nervous all day. I just didn't want to be there. In the next to last period, I was in math class, and I told the boy behind me that I was going home. I asked the teacher, and she didn't care. I asked the principal, Mr. Felton Wagoner, if I could go home instead of just going to study hall. He said, okay, as long as you get your lessons. So I started home. I didn't live but half a mile from the school. Just before I got to the house, I saw my mother come out the front door. We were standing about 10 feet apart when the school blew up. W.G. Bud Watson was in the 8th grade. I was in shop class, which was on the 1st floor, with about 30 other boys. It was getting close to quitting time, and I was doing some welding in the front of the room when our teacher, Lemmy Butler, must have pulled an electrical switch to get the machine to work, the fatal switch, which set off the explosion. Next thing I knew, I was picking myself up outside of the building. I don't remember flying out of the window, but the building was still coming down. William Folis was in the 7th grade. He stated, I was sitting to the next to the last seat in the back of the class, and the teacher called me up to the front. She said, get up here, hurry up. I said, what did I do? She repeated, get up here. I had barely reached the teacher and sat down when the room went. A blast came across straight horizontal. All these steel lockers that had been ebbed in the wall blew kids out of their seats and fell on top of us. H.G. White was in the 5th grade. I started turning my head to the left to look out the window, but then I heard a big boom. It felt like something hit me beside the head. Then it was dark. I was not unconscious, I was awake, but I was sitting in a hole and could barely make out moans and groans. Everything had slowed down. Once I got out, I walked over to the water fountain in the gymnasium to wash off a cut above my left ear, and an older boy walked up with deep cuts on his face. A teacher threw some water on him, and he fell down and expired right there. Liddell Carpenter was in the 8th grade. She recalls, I heard a boom and a hissing sound, just like splintering wood. I jumped out of my seat and started a step or two. That was the last thing I remember for a while. Carolyn Fry was in the 5th grade. She recalls, my teacher, Mr. Sorry, pushed Barbara Page and me out of a classroom window and then crawled through after us. Barbara Page remembers, well, Carolyn and I got outside. We just stood there. We didn't know what to do. There was a deathly silence. Nothing. Like you were in a vacuum. Then all the sounds started coming, screaming, moaning, and people began to run all over. Billy Matthews was in the 6th grade. She recalls, I had been shielded by my desk, but it was covered with concrete boulders. One boy was screaming, "Ah! Ah!" My legs cut off. We had been in a classroom on the top level, but the whole floor was now ground level, or just about, when we landed. We didn't remember feeling or hearing anything. We just woke up and there we were. One minute you're listening to a book report and the next minute you're stuck under a pile of debris. Normalcy replaced by chaos. Maxine Lawson was in the 6th grade. She remembers that Billy was saying, Maxine, help me out. And I didn't. I know I didn't. She doesn't remember that. All of the people in the front of the room were killed. The girl reading the book report, the teacher. I guess the wall fell on them. Another student, Dorothy Box, stated, I could hear the sirens coming in, and I wondered if there was a fire. I could hear a student screaming, don't go down the stairs. There was a big boulder hanging over the stairwell about to come crashing down. I was yelling to my friend, Pearl, who had been standing to my left, and she never answered me. I didn't know at the time that she had cement dust in her mouth. Charles Dial was in the 6th grade. He states, I had run home to get my band uniform, and I was just sitting down to put on my shoes when the school exploded. We heard explosions all the time from the boilers in the oil fields, but my mother said, "Something's happened over there." And I said, "It's probably one of those steam buildings blown up." And she said, "It's too loud. You get over there and see about your brothers. Get." So I started off towards the school, and on the way I ran into my older brother, John, coming across the field. He was in rough shape. He said he was in shop class when he asked the teacher to turn the bandsaw on, and when he opened the electrical box and pulled the switch, the electricity arced. I told John to go home, and then I'd find our brother Travis. I couldn't believe what I saw when I got to the school. On the east wing, there were a few bricks that didn't get knocked down. On the south side, there was a little of the building left. The rest was all gone, flattened. The children were lying all over the ground. Nobody really knew what happened. Martha Peggy Melton remembers. "I thought we had been bombed by Hitler. I crawled out from what used to be the ceiling and saw the children jumping out the windows. One was hanging on there, bleeding to death," she recalls. "I remember seeing a red-headed girl whose hair turned the color of cement. She was lying outside. I don't remember seeing anybody to talk to. The people I saw were dead. I was walking around, and I realized I still had a pencil in my hand. And I remember thinking, what am I doing with this pencil? I threw it down." Lucy Wells was in the 10th grade. She remembers. "When I got out, I saw a body in a black suit, a teacher. He looked like a big doll that someone had dropped on the floor and was asleep. And then my brain began to work a little. I could see the building was gone. I knew the body in front of me was dead, but it was all like a dream. I guess the event was so traumatizing that it didn't register right away." Betty P. McBride was in the 7th grade. She remembers. "When I emerged from the building, I made my way towards the front, near the street. I saw a playmate's body almost covered in concrete, with a popsicle still in her mouth. I went around a car that was upside down, with wheels spinning wildly. When I got to the front of what had been the school building, I saw a man crying and holding a little girl's body. And as I walked along, I saw what looked like a child's brain, which had fallen out of the back of her head." Juana Faye Tonis remembers. "When I finally got out, the first person I saw was my mother, who was the president of the PTA. She was climbing over the wall to my classroom. She grabbed me and asked, 'What happened?' And I said, 'I have no idea.'" Ollie Wyatt was in the 3rd grade. She states, "I had just finished performing a minuet in the gymnasium for the PTA, and I had walked up to the stands to sit down next to my mother, when all of a sudden, the building, which was wooden, started rocking back and forth. There were just a few doors in the whole gymnasium, and we started rushing outside. My mother grabbed me, and we kept going. We were rushing away from the building because it was still moving. I was standing near Mr. Wagoner. When I finally realized what happened, he put his hand over my face and said, 'Oh my God, it's our children.'" People were yelling, "The world is coming to an end." Within minutes, oil field workers began to arrive and dig through the rubble. By nightfall, as word of the disaster spread, at least 200 workers were tearing apart the site as parents searched for their children. Ira Moore was in the 10th grade. He recalls, "We'd carry the bodies to the buses and trucks that were parked nearby and laid them out on the seats. I don't know what happened to them after that." William Follis recalls, "After I came to, several minutes after the blast, I started helping the rescue workers dig kids out. Right in front of me, there were 3 little girls wedged together. They had mortar dust caked in their eyes, noses, and mouths. And all we would have had to do to save them was reach down and pull the mud out. I knew the kids. One of them looked up and said, 'Save me.' 30 or 40 men were trying to dig them out completely. I watched them die." Later on, outside, I spotted one of my best friends who was still alive, but it looked like someone had spilled his brains open with a hatchet. The rescue workers weren't always checking to see if the kids were alive or dead. They were just getting them out. One girl was completely twisted around. The poor thing. She was trying to cover herself up because she was exposed. Everyone was working like they were just in a daze. Nobody said anything. Mary Lou Morning was in the 6th grade. She remembers, "I thought I had fallen asleep and was having a nightmare, and that if I screamed, I'd wake myself up. Those sitting on the side and in front of me were killed. I'm sure being knocked under the desk was my protection. Someone pulled me out and placed me on the ground." James Kennedy was in the 6th grade. He claims, The rescue workers were moving towards me, and I couldn't move anything but my eyes. But I could breathe fine. We were still screaming for help. I heard Mary Lou screaming, and when some men came into our area, I said, "Get her out first. I think she's hurt worse than I am." Molly Ward was in the 4th grade. She recalls, "When I got home on the bus, there were about 8 mothers at the stop. They started screaming, 'Have you seen Geneva? Have you seen Brenda?' My mother came out and started hugging and kissing me. She carried me into the house because the mothers kept screaming. 6 of them lost their children. Fran Van Alsen was in the 5th grade. She remembers, "My throat was so dry from the dust, I tried to get across the street to a lunch place where I thought I could get a drink. But the ambulances and the cars were racing across so fast, I couldn't get over there. I sat down beside a car and leaned against a tire and watched the bakery and cattle trucks unload so they could help carry children to hospitals and morgues. It seemed like I sat there for an eternity. My dad had been looking for me in the room where I had class and found a girl with a foot hanging off who was wearing a dress that was similar to mine. But he noticed she had on black patent leather shoes and knew mine were lace-ups. Finally, someone told him where I was waiting. He said that every step he took towards me seemed like I was taking 2 steps away from him. My mother was standing out in the backyard under a trellis over the gate. When she saw my dad's car drive up, I got out and started going to her. I had blood all over me, and I was skinned on my right side. My hair was snow white from the plaster dust. I guess I looked a fright. She wouldn't put her arms out. She just kept saying, "That's not my baby. That's not her." Max Holliman remembers, "My dad found my sister. She was dead. He recognized her because of the dress she was wearing, and the socks she had on were material he had picked out for her 12th birthday." Opal Hamill was in the 9th grade. She remembers, "Mr. Wagner laid my dead brother at my feet. My brother was 17, almost 18. He was a beautiful boy. He was the captain of the football team, co-captain of the basketball team. Mr. Wagner didn't say anything to me. I sat down beside my brother, and he wasn't obviously hurt. All he had was a little round hole in his forehead, like maybe the point of a nail hit him. He always carried a handkerchief in his pocket, so I took it out and wiped the mortar dust off his face. I sat there too shocked to cry. 2 ambulance drivers picked him up and strapped him to a stretcher, and I started following along behind them. Finally, I said, "Where are you taking him?" They said they were taking him to Longview, which was 26 miles away. Now, I was a kid, and Longview seemed awfully far, so I said, "No, that's too far." They didn't argue. They lifted him off the stretcher and put him on the ground and went on to the next body. Marjorie Kinney recalls, "There was one area by the fence for the dead and another area for the injured. My friend's daddy picked her up and laid her with the ones who were dead, but turns out she was only unconscious. I didn't know how she got up." Bob Clayton was in the 5th grade. "When I finally came to, some guy pulled me out from under the locker and said, 'Sonny, where do you live?' I said, 'Selman City. I have to catch the bus.' He said he'd carry me up to where the buses were, and he sat down and said, 'Wait right here. I'll get my car.' Then some other man saw me, and he could see my head was bruised up, and he put me in the front seat of the ambulance. In the back, kids were stacked up like wood." Lois Johnson was in the 7th grade. She remembers, "My dad was helping me with the rescue efforts, and one of our neighbors told him he had seen me and that I was dead. He told her that he didn't doubt it. When he came home and saw me, he nearly dropped dead himself. He stood there with his mouth open. He said he wasn't surprised at all to hear I was dead, but more shocked to find out I wasn't, because there were few telephones in the area at the time. The Western Union office in Overton was responsible for dispatching most of the news of the disaster. By 10 o'clock Thursday night, reporters from major media outlets have arrived. On Friday morning, after the drizzling rain turned into a full thunderstorm, the weary rescue teams dug out the final remains. By noon, the skies cleared. Exhausted workers began to leave, saluted by National Guardsmen. 10 days later, on Easter Sunday, after most families had buried their loved ones in nearby cemeteries, hundreds of visitors arrived for a memorial service at the explosion site. Many of the victims were brought to Pleasant Hill Cemetery, located between New London and Henderson. Bill Thompson remembers, "About 10 days after the explosion, we were trying to assemble classes in the gym, but we had no gas in there, and it was cold. On March 29th, it started snowing, and when we got out, everything was solid white, a blanket of snow. The teacher called out roll for our class to see how many were there. Someone would answer, 'He's in the hospital,' or 'His folks moved back to Arkansas,' but sometimes it was that he had been killed. When they called the name of the little girl I had switched seats with, I realized she had been killed sitting in my seat. I didn't know till that day. I buried the guilt for many years before I came to deal with it. I took the blame for a lot of things. A large memorial in the median of Texas State Highway 42, across from the school site erected in 1939, commemorates the disaster. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. What really stands out to me is how gruesome the memories that these children have, as if they lived through a war zone. I just think maybe people back in the 30s were a bit tougher than they are now. I still can't get over the fact that they returned to class only 10 days after witnessing the horrific deaths of their friends, relatives, and classmates. I know things like PTSD weren't really as well known yet, but I can only imagine how terrible it was. What stands out to me the most is the memory where the teacher was calling out the roll, and a few said present, but some, the students knew, would remain eternally silent when it was their turn on the list. May the souls of those young people taken too early rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We will meet again in the darkness of the night.